This is the second lecture for week 3. So the first lecture considered the bioecological model of human development, and now we're going to look at how socialization occurs within social contexts. So the second lecture of the week 3 is actually the first of 3 lectures that are specifically looking at socialization. So we're breaking it into 3 parts, first looking at a definition of socialization and outcomes of socialization, and then we're sort of working backwards from looking at outcomes and aims of socialization to, in the next 2 lectures, looking at the agents of socialization, so who does the socialization, the process of socialization, and then what methods do they use for socialization. So again, you'll sort of see it all put together in a diagram, but the discussion of socialization is broken out over these 3 next lectures. What is socialization? So let's start with the definition of socialization. So socialization is really how a person, and it starts for very young children, so let's say a child or an adult acquires the rules, standards, and values of his or her family, group, and culture. So let's unpack that. It's how a person learns about the rules, the standards, and the values of what it means to belong to a family, what it means to belong to a group. So a group could be what it means to belong to the group of students, at a university, or the group of people in a society who are called women or men, or the group of people who are athletes. So all the kinds of groups you can think of, and also a culture. So that's the dominant mainstream culture. So what it means to be Australian. It also means belonging to subcultures. So you may think about your own culture, and your family may come from a different country, so you might have an ethnic culture. You may have a culture that comes from your religious background. So there's various groups basically that we belong to. The group of the family, a small group. Larger groups like our gender that we'll talk about. Different groups that we affiliate with, like belonging to a sport group or being a student, having certain social roles, and then the cultures to which we belong. And socialization really is learning about what it means to have these kinds of affiliations, what it means to belong to these kinds of groups. We are not born knowing how to be within any of those types of groups. We have to learn what it means. And so, as we'll talk about in a minute, the process of socialization is most intense during childhood, but it really continues throughout your life. So you are experiencing a kind of socialization right now as a student, where you're learning the rules and standards and values of what it is to be a student at the University of Wollongong, what it means to be an undergraduate student. And this continues throughout life when you enter into new contexts and you have to learn what it means to be part of that new context. So socialization, as I was just saying, a little bit to elaborate on that definition, socialization occurs through interactions and communications. So we're going to look at, in a later lecture, the methods of socialization. But socialization happens through, the meeting of 2 people, or a person and media, for example. There's some kind of interaction going on between people, even if it's one-sided, as in the case of media. But there's some kind of interaction going on where someone is talking and interacting in some way with another person. And it's a person who is important to the person who's being socialized. So that's a lot of what we'll talk about in the methods section as well. It's a lot of what gives socialization its power is that socialization is directed from people that we care about, that we have relationships with. Socialization is reciprocal and dynamic. So this is the idea that was mentioned in the first lecture. People are not passive recipients of socialization. They also influence the ways that they're treated in their interactions because of who they are, their personality, their temperament. You think about a child. If a child is outgoing or shy, that affects how they're treated by their teachers or their parents or peers. So it's reciprocal. Socialization can be intentional or unintentional. So intentional socialization is where there's a clear message that's being delivered, and the socialization agent is very clear about what that message is. There's consequences if a message isn't received, so there might be punishments that come along with not acting in a certain way. Unintentional socialization takes place spontaneously with a person's deliberate intent to socialize and to impart knowledge and values. So you can think about, particularly with children, children are always being socialized, but it's not always intentional. So sometimes even a family, like a parent can be passing along a value that's part of that family, but may not even realize that's what they're doing. So it doesn't have to be intentional, it can be unintentional. And socialization is lifelong. So as I mentioned, you are being socialized really right now as a student, and you will be in other times in your life when you enter into new contexts. But it's really most intensive. Socialization is most intensive in childhood and then also in adolescence, but really in younger childhood and early and middle childhood, as children are learning what it means to belong again to a family or to a group, what kind of rules they need to follow, how they need to govern their own behavior. So this is a diagram of the various things that we're going to look at in terms of socialization. It's a bit full on to see all these pieces. The reading really refers to children, but as I said, you can think about individual or person and substitute that, because we're not just looking at child development, we're looking at lifespan development. And people are socialized throughout their lives. But again, it's most intensive during childhood. So let me just sort of go over this diagram. So the child or the individual brings along their biological characteristics and the way that they are. So that's the nature piece that we talked about in week 1. And that includes things like age and gender, physical development, intelligence, temperament. So they bring their own personal qualities to their interactions. That's that being reciprocal and dynamic. And then children are socialized, and individuals, but let's just talk about children now, are socialized in different developmental areas. So we're particularly in this class looking at the emotional and social side of development, but there's also cognitive and behavioral. We'll look at some behavioral elements of development too. So those are the areas of development that are really influenced by socialization. Different methods are used. So we have a lecture where we'll look at all of methods: the affective method, the operant method, observational, cognitive, sociocultural, and apprenticeship. So the later lecture will define those. So these methods are used to socialize people, children in this case, and different agents are socializing the person, the individual. And so there's a lecture about that as well. So different agents of socialization include parents, siblings, relatives, teachers, peers, community, mass media. So that's with whom the individual is interacting for that socialization experience, and different methods like the affective and the operant method are being used. And then those processes of socialization result in outcomes of socialization, including knowing how to complete developmental tasks, knowledge, values, morals, etc. So we're going to come back to these outcomes in this lecture. So this is social, an overview of it, but we're going to break it down in these lectures to look at first, sort of towards the end of this diagram, we're going to look at the outcomes of socialization. And then in the other lectures, we'll work backwards. And one of the lectures looks at agents of socialization and what aims they might be really encouraging in terms of socialization. And then another lecture looks at methods of socialization. So what do these words mean? Effective, operant, etc. We'll come back to that. So again, the idea is that you sort of start with a child, for example, and the child needs to develop outcomes such as an understanding of what it means to have certain roles or understanding of themselves. And that happens through relationships with important people like parents and teachers and peers, and using methods like the observational method and the operant method that we'll talk more about. And there's an overlap here with the first lecture. So the first lecture looked at the bioecological model of human development. And that really gives us, again, a sense of all the contexts in which an individual may be participating and will be socialized into what it means to belong to those different contexts. Peers are a powerful source of socialization. So is the family, schools and childcare, the media, and community. These are really agents of socialization. And then there's the broader society, like culture and ethnicity, religion, and there are messages about from the broader society that come through the agents of socialization, like family, like peers, like media. And so this diagram really relates back to socialization, because socialization takes place through the relationships and through the social contexts that are shown in ecological. So the whole point of socialization is to develop certain capacities to let us function within a family, within groups, within the broader culture and the society. And so some of the major aims of socialization are described in your reading. And some of these are really critical in terms of, for children to develop their understanding and their ability to fit into society. So a lot of the focus in terms of raising children is socializing children in these different types of areas to encourage these types of aims. So one is around developing a self-concept, and we'll return to the concept of the self and related concepts in week 5. But self-concept is how an individual perceives his or her identity as distinct from others. And so, this is something that evolves over time. We'll talk about this more in week 5, but you think about a small baby, up until and through adolescence, it's a time of identity formation, and we're getting a lot of messages from other people about who it is that we are. Sometimes we get that through direct, verbal instruction, this is how you are. And sometimes we get, punished for being a certain way, or rewarded for doing certain things. So those are ways in which our self-concept is influenced by socialization. Enabling self-regulation. So self-regulation is another outcome, another aim of socialization. And that means things like controlling one's behavior. Think about a young child being able to manage one's temper and being able to wait and delay gratification. But it also means things like, controlling your desire, to do something fun and watch a television show rather than watch this lecture. You have to manage yourself, and you have to regulate your desires as an adult as well. So you've had to learn that, through your childhood. Learning and appropriate social roles. So another aim of socialization is to learn what the functions are for different roles, like being a parent, being a friend, a student, or an employee. So through socialization, for example, through the observational method and modeling, we get to see what it's like for people to be in different roles. And then apprenticeship, we practice different roles. And so learning what it means to be in different types of roles is part of being socialized, to be within a group or a society. And then implementing developmental skills. So, there are a number of skills that children learn that they get through socialization. So how to speak, how to relate to others, how to do math, a lot of cognitive type of skills like that. So children are taught that through socialization, through direct instruction. We'll talk about that method and that technique, through modeling, through watching others. Children learn things like how to tie their shoe. We expect that of people at a certain age. So developmental skills are those skills that are necessary to succeed and that we expect of people at different ages. You don't expect a newborn to tie their shoe, but you expect a 5-year-old to be able to tie their shoe. And so socialization is a way that people learn the skills that are appropriate at their developmental level. So in addition to those aims of socialization that are, really many of those are about how children can be prepared to become adults and part of a society, there are other types of socialization outcomes that are described in your reading, and these are just a few examples that are outcomes of how we are socialized even throughout our lives. So for example, values. You get socialized into what are the values, the qualities, and the beliefs that are perceived as important for different groups. If you join a new religion or you're brought up in a religion, if you, move to a new society or you grow up in society, you learn about what's valued in that particular group. If you join a new profession or have a new recreation, you learn what it is that a group values and it perceives as being desirable. Attitudes are an outcome of socialization. So if you think about attitudes like racism or sexism, those are really outcomes of socialization. Children are not born racist or sexist. That's something that they're learning through observing people who are important in their lives, parents, their peers, and hearing how they talk, observing, having peer pressure in terms of thinking, talking in certain ways about people. So those are negative kinds of attitudes that we perceive as negative can be outcomes of socialization, and so can being empathetic and pro-social. Those are ways of attitudes that can be encouraged through socialization. Morals are another outcome of socialization. So how people learn what is right and wrong comes from the messages they receive from important people in their lives. Being the operant method of socialization we'll talk about is about what happens following a behavior. So when children are punished when they do something wrong, or praised when they do something right, that helps them understand what is right and wrong. Self-esteem is another outcome of socialization. These are the messages that people get about themselves, and help sort of shapes how people think about their own identities. And so we can receive direct comment about ourselves, or receive praise in terms of certain qualities, and maybe punishment for other ways that we tend to be, and that influences how people form their self-esteem. And gender roles are another outcome that we're going to be talking about both this week and then when we talk about identity in week 5. Gender roles are qualities that individuals understand characterize what is expected of a male or a female within a culture. And we learn that in many ways through important sources like media, like our families, like our peers, observing them, seeing how people act, seeing how, what's praised and what's rewarded and what's looked down upon in terms of the behaviors of males and females. So these are the kinds of outcomes of socialization. And in the next 2 lectures, we'll look at the sources of socialization, which are the agents of socialization, and also the methods used for socialization.